So let us know, Rajni, when we're live, and then Lawrence can kick off the meeting, and
You're live now.
we're live now. Okay.
Okay, let me start. Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual meeting of the Audit, Finance and Risk Committee of the Toronto Seniors Housing Corporation, which is being live streamed. In addition to the participating board members and the interim leadership team, I'm pleased to welcome our virtual audience and thank you for joining us. I want to thank the transition team, Naum, Michael, and Rajni for the preparation of the materials brought forward for today's meeting. Let me begin with the land acknowledgement. As a committee of the City of Toronto Corporation, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. May I now have a motion for approval of the public agenda?
So move, Mr. Chair.
And I'll like to second it. All in favor? So it is carried. The next item is the conflict of interest. Does any member have any conflict?
Not I.
Hearing none, we will move to the next item. That's the item 4, approval of the minutes of the AFRC meeting on March 14th.
I have read the minutes, draft minutes, Mr. Chair. I have no questions or comments.
Yeah. So in that case, we need a resolution, motion, need a mover.
So move.
Moved by Warren and seconded by me, carried. The next item is approval of the closed sessions of the meeting of March 14th, 2022.
I so move, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, moved by Warren and seconded by me. It's carried. The next is item 6. That's finance-related policies for approval. No.
Thank you, Lawrence. There are 3 policies before you today: a procurement policy, an expense claims policy, and an investments policy. And for the, I'll deal with each of them separately. The procurement policy is fundamentally what Toronto Community Housing has as its policy and procedures. Some of the procedural things have changed a bit because we have injected ourselves into the process, but the policy statements are by and large the same. They, I would say, mirror the broader public sector BPS guidelines in terms of good procurement practice and how we would go about engaging vendors as appropriate. I think the only thing that has been added to the policy is there's a chart that actually outlines the delegated authority by type of procurement. So whether it's competitively bid or single sourced or sole sourced, and that's been added, and I think adds some clarity to what levels are required for approval depending upon the method of procurement and when the board gets involved and when the CEO gets involved, etc. So that we added, which was not part of the documentation we received from Toronto Community Housing. Our involvement from a procurement practice point of view is we will be responsible as an organization for identifying what we want to buy, how we want to buy it, etc. The actual procurement of the goods and services and the posting of any of RFXs, etc., would be done through Toronto Community Housing. I mean, that's a shared service that we're paying for. They will evaluate the RFX, will be part of any evaluation teams, etc. So a lot of the policy principles are consistent across the two organizations, and the delegated authority limits are those that were approved by our board some months ago and are consistent, they're the same as Toronto Community Housing. So we opted not to change delegated authorities, try and keep the systems the same. The dollar values for approval are significantly higher than what would be probably typical in an organization this size. And that'll be something that over time, Tom and his team can work with community housing to perhaps change the workflows and delegated authorities in the system. So the procurement policy, I think, is a good one, and it reflects BPS, broader public sector policies. So that's the first one. The second one is an expense claims policy, and it is also a BPS policy in content and form, where it describes what's eligible, what's not eligible, who can approve. The only thing I mentioned at the outset of this meeting before we started was that we've removed the whole P card process, because we're going to be eliminating the P card. There's only one, by the way, in the SHU right now, in seniors housing units. So we're going to go a different route. And it's coming to the board because the board can claim expenses. If you read parts of it, you can actually claim childcare expenses. I'm just dying for someone on our board to claim those.
Hey,
But there is an eligibility for those as well. And there's a whole process for, making the claims. And it's consistent with Toronto Community Housing. And so the folks who are using expense claims policy now at the SHU will be very familiar with the whole process and the way claims are submitted. Claims are paid through payroll, as a payroll amount, and then charged to the appropriate cost center. So expense claim policy, I think, is also very well written and was mirrored, no doubt, after some BPS work that was done by community housing some years ago. And the final policy is an investments policy, which is not mirrored after Toronto Community Housing, because they have a very deep and rich policy given their investments and the required use of those investments over time to fund their capital expansions. So this policy is more around what would we do with in-year cash that was excess, and how we would invest it, which are very secure government of Canada or provincial bonds or GICs. So it's very limited, and I think will serve us well until we generate, any sort of sizable cash surpluses that we could invest. So that's sort of the long and short of several hundred pages of documentation of both policy procedures, and I think we included some forms for your review.
and procedures.
And procedures. So I'd be happy to respond to questions, and if we've got some typos or errors, we can get those amended. If you could, just refer to the page number, and then Rajni and I can work to amend that.
Norm, just one further question about the procurement policy. Primarily, is there an owner for this policy in management? Is there a designated point person or owner of the policy?
Yes, there will be. One of one of the positions, and you'll hear about it later, we have a position within the finance portfolio called manager procurement. And
Yeah.
that person will be accountable for liaising with our seniors housing folks in terms of buying things, as well as liaising with community housing in terms of the relationship on the procurement side. So yes, there'll be an owner. Ultimately, that owner could be if Tom hires like a director of finance ultimately, but there's been none of Tom's senior folks have been recruited. So I would think at an executive level, all three of these will be owned by a director of some sort, CFO or finance director or CAO. I'm not sure how Tom's going to structure his
Right.
group, but all of these will be owned by that group.
And similarly for the investment policy.
Yeah, all three would have ownership at an executive level with who would have a finance accountability. Operationally, I would see procurement policy being managed on a day-to-day basis by the manager of procurement, the expense claims policy by the controller, and investments policy probably by the controller as well. But from an executive perspective, there'll be someone to work that those positions will report to.
Thank you.
Norm, I have a couple of, I'm just trying to understand. There's those tables, delegation of authority, very tiny ones. There's a box, it says seniors housing unit. Our corporation will have that unit within TSHC?
Yes, so the way the delegation of authority at community housing worked, and we adopted that 100% and the board approved it, is actually like the director of seniors housing unit as a director within community housing actually has a delegated authority lower than some of the other VPs. So there's actually those tables actually show the delegated authority of positions in the SHU and also the delegated authority for everyone else depending upon their level.
So we will be modifying for our corporation?
Not at this time. That's the delegated authority
That we approved
that the board approved, and we couldn't see the issue with the Yardi system, right, the system we're using is delegated authority is tied to a position description. And so we had to map it to allow that to continue. So within Toronto community housing, for example, they have a CFO. We don't have a CFO, and that but we've mapped that to a director of finance level position provisionally until Tom decides what he wants to do. And all of the other directors provisionally, like wellness, public relations, HR, would all have delegated authority as VPs. And those delegated authorities are higher than at the SHU. And I think the SHU is operating at a different level. Like it was more like a division and not a corporate VP or corporate function. So they have different levels of authority and it actually goes down quite low to managers and supervisors, etc. So those exist right now. So on June 1, those folks will have the same delegated authority as they do now.
And later, when they need to modify them, they have to come back to the board again?
Well, yes, I would imagine. So you could look at it in two different ways. You could look at it as the board has delegated authority to the CEO and has given levels of authority I'm just making numbers up, like $500,000, Tom can do X, but over $500,000 he can't. But once the board has defined his delegation, I think it's up to Tom to delegate authority within his organization. And that I've seen it both ways, where the CEO's delegation of authority is approved by the board, and I've seen it sometimes where the CEO's delegation of authority, the CEO informs the board of what he or she has done, right? So I don't know how this board wants to operate, whether they want to approve the CEO's delegation, or they're happy knowing what their delegation is and being aware of what that individual is delegating to the rest of the organization.
Okay. And these procedures are only for information purpose, right?
Yeah, you're not approving procedures, but it was just for your information. You're approving policy.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, somewhere. Okay, let me go back to. I think it's an expense claim. I mean, it's a procedure. I'm just my observation. Direct payment to a supplier talks about check requisition and preparing a check. I mean, it's a hotel booking or your conference booking. I think no longer checks are sent. It's
Right.
booked online and paid by credit card. So probably these procedures will have to be changed by them.
Yeah, it could be. We maybe have to update some of them for sure. For sure.
And then again, they talk about the forms, and they have to be signed, and then ultimately the person claiming that has to scan them and email to finance probably for
That's correct.
reimbursement. And they have to retain, how long they have to retain, and probably they have to look into all those things. Anyway, the procedures are not the board's concern, so I'm just my observation.
Well, well, we can certainly take those back and have them looked at, but remember the transaction, we will be approving transactions, but the transaction processing will be done by community housing. So we wanted to try and keep it as close to what they're doing as possible.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions, Warren? On this?
No, I'm fine. I'm comfortable with all three policies.
In that
And-
case, sorry. We can move to the next item, item 7. That's this committee's work plan activities and scheduling of future meetings.
So just so are you? This is an approval item number 6.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So we need a motion for that. Okay. So we need a motion for that. Warren, would you?
Yeah, I'm prepared to move a motion to recommend the approval of all three policies.
Yeah, and then seconded by me. And it's since there is no opposition, it's all carried. Okay, so now we'll move to item number 7. That's this committee's work plan activities and future meetings.
So I'm just going to share a little document that I put together for you, and I just need to find it. I don't see it. So sorry, little technical glitch here. Let me just. Just a second, let me close some stuff here. Oh, here we are. Here we are. Can you see this?
Yep.
So this is parsed out of the work plan that I showed you some time ago. I still haven't put it into the format, which I will do. But these are the sort of upcoming activities for the next quarter, I guess, through September. So we currently don't have a meeting of this committee set beyond today, so we're going to have to do that. There is a board meeting at the end of June, and so we might want to have proposing to have a meeting in June, whereby we would report our activities essentially up to Transition Day, May 31st. At that point in time, we will have some permanent staff, which I will share with you in camera. So I think it might be worthwhile to meet them. And then there's the status of reporting and related matters. So that's we'll be able to give you sort of an early view of how things are going and sort of the transition and sort of interesting the things that we're seeing early on, because we all hope that this will go smoothly, and I think by and large it will, but there'll be little glitches all along the way, and we would anticipate that. So this I would propose would be the content of that meeting, and with the exception of the second item, that's what the work plan had contemplated. Then there's another board meeting, not another board meeting until the end of September, but there's a preliminary budget is due to the city early September. So this is preliminary. It's not a final approved budget, but it's at the beginning of that sort of conversation with the city and whether or not the board wants to have an early view of what's being contemplated. This 2023 budget will also be a little unusual in that Toronto community housing will still have a lot of the access and be building a large portions of the Toronto seniors housing budget. And just to remind you, the revenue from Toronto seniors housing revenue for this fiscal year is rent that's from tenants and the city subsidy, et cetera, that will continue to be paid to Toronto community housing, less operating expenses to run those buildings. The net of that is our revenue. So we don't have visibility necessarily on what the rent budgets should be or the real activity behind them will be for 2023. So it's going to have to be some sort of combined effort between the two organizations to submit a budget for Toronto seniors housing for this coming year. Plus, 2023 will be the first year where the non-community housing budget, so this is all the stand-up of Tom and his group in the back office, etc., will go forward to the city as a budget line item as opposed to just cash flow, which is what they're doing this year. So Tom will be busy over, and his team will be busy over the summer period trying to assess what they think they're going to need from the city and working with the city. So it's going to be, and I think the city acknowledges, another pardon me, sort of transitional year. And it won't be till 2024 that we really sort of get a good true sense of what Toronto seniors housing will look like on a go-forward basis. So that I think it's probably worthwhile for the audit committee to be having some view of the early view of what this looks like. And there'll be a lot of planning and consultations with community housing over the summer as to how this might roll out. But I'm not sure. So I guess, Lawrence, you can contemplate if you wanted to, thinking of having another board meeting or not, to look at what is a preliminary budget and not a final budget. Also in August is probably an early view of the corporation's insurance coverage for the next year. And the insurance period, or the premium period, is November 1 to October 31, and that is through that comes through the Housing Services Corporation. The next board meeting after September 29th is November 29th, and that's after the requirements of the insurance. So there would be, I guess, an early recommendation of insurance coverage here. We will continue likely to pay insurance from Toronto Community Housing for its share of building equipment or even cyber risk insurance, but all the other insurances, general commercial liability, D&O, crime, abuse, tenant relations, etc., would have to come through this group. And we have made application for June 1 to October 31, and that's currently in process. So this is another item that was in the work plan for an August meeting. And then a view of the second quarter financial results. So that would be to the end of June. And I think it'll take the team a bit of time to create some reports and pull off like a June year-to-date result. So we are going to be loading January to the end of May into the RD system. And then we'll have 1 month of activity in the system, and hopefully by August we've got that sort of ironed out. The process for recording these transactions between the two corporations is basically cash flow and book to budget on a quarterly basis and reconcile at the end of the quarter. So we may, when we report the end of June, have a picture of the month of June that's more based on budget than actual at this time. So that's the view of what's coming forward, and I can work with Lawrence and Rajni to book these two audit meetings for June and August. I will comment in camera as to who's going to be available to do what in these two meetings.
Okay. Thanks, Norm. Warren, what do you think? I mean, should we have one more board meeting in August?
Should we have a committee meeting in advance of the August board meeting?
Yeah, no, we don't have any board meeting in August.
Yeah.
Probably we may need, we should have a committee meeting before the board meeting if it all.
Yeah, I'm completely at the disposal of the committee, and so to be happy to be participating in the committee meetings.
Lawrence, the September 1 deadline, and this is all budget timing based upon material that we received back in January, is a submission to the city. It's in early September, but the final, there's a budget committee, an informal budget committee meeting of the city in November, and then the budget committee presentations to the city are in early January. So chances are the audit committee could see an early view of how the budget's forming, but it's probably like a late December, early January board meeting where there'll be approvals required.
So we don't need a board meeting in August. That's what you're
Probably not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, certainly we can have committee meeting.
I was just going to say, Lawrence, I would agree. I think we'll have an opportunity in September to go over what has been submitted. As Norm says, I think it's probably a first pass with the city on the 2023 budget, but I would suggest we can do that you'll be able to see it in September.
Okay, thank you. If you don't have any further comments or questions, we will move to a closed session next. Rajini?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, oh, yes, we needed a motion and